This is the fourth lecture in the introduction to the course Interpreting the New Testament. And in this lecture, I would like to talk about the tasks of theological inquiry. I'd like to introduce you to the idea that there are four tasks of theological inquiry with this chart. And so the first task of theology is the descriptive task, and that is exegesis, largely the subject of this particular course. The second task is a synthetic task. The first two tasks both have to do with our interpretation of Scripture. And in the synthetic task, we're really doing biblical theology. The question in biblical theology is, what is the unity and diversity within Scripture? So in the descriptive task, you may be interpreting what Paul says about faith and works, and then you might interpret what James says about faith and works. But in the synthetic task, you want to say, well, how do we relate what Paul says to what James says? That's the synthetic task. Notice that when we talk about the text, on the descriptive task, we're talking about a specific text, a passage within a certain author's writing. Whereas when we talk about the text in the synthetic task, now we're talking about the canon. We have a faith statement about these texts as authoritative, and we want to interpret these texts with respect to their synthesis, their unity and diversity. The third theological task is what we need to call something like the convictional task. It's not necessarily systematic theology at all. Systematic theology would be one example of a convictional task. But we have more convictions than are placed in a systematic theology. And systematic theology is one way of doing theology. Narrative theology is another way of doing theology. So the larger category would be something like convictional task. How do we frame our convictions? How do we come to our convictions about what we believe, about God, about convictions about what are the right practices, the ethics, what we should be doing in mission work? And so this is the subject of the convictional task. Here we move beyond just the canon as our, quote, text, unquote, to talking about whatever's authoritative, scripture, tradition, experience, and so forth, as related to the earlier discussion of those authorities. And then the pragmatic task is the fourth task. It is, how do we live this out in our community, in our culture, in our society today? The contextual authority weighs in here. What is normative and what is relative in Scripture for our day and age? What is the nature of the community and the culture in which we live? What about what's possible, what we should do in the way of practices in our day? And also, how has the pragmatic task been worked out over the centuries by different communities and different cultures? And so that's the subject of the fourth task of theology. We actually often begin from anywhere on that spectrum of tasks. We might begin with the pragmatic task very often, and then have to do the hard work of exegesis and biblical theology to challenge whatever practices we have. Also, our convictions might be handed to us, and then the question is, how will we reshape our convictions in light of either of the other three tasks? And so this is the subject of interpretation in terms of four tasks of theology. Now, what I've gone through here in introducing this is the row called the focus of study and its authority. But we could also go through these four tasks in terms of how we use the text. So in the descriptive task, their primary goal is to describe what is in the text by looking behind the text, in the text, and in front of the text, being aware of our presuppositions and reading the text. In the synthetic task, the focus, using the text has to do with our understanding of how important it is to reconstruct the historical situation with respect to the actual theology of the text. Does our theology change if we reconstruct the historical setting differently? Do we prioritize theology or history, and how do they relate to each other? There's the question of the unity and diversity of Scripture. There's the question also of the role of the reader in synthesizing the literature. On the convictional task side, we want to look at the rival versions of inquiry that we've talked about in this lecture already. The modernist, the postmodernist, the deconstructive, and the tradition approaches. And on the pragmatic side, we're exploring Christian life, really, in various dimensions: missions, ethics, worship, education, counseling. And so we ask questions such as, how do we focus our moral vision in terms of God's character, in terms of humanity, in terms of missions, and so forth? How do we go about focusing our vision as a community of Christ today? Questions of discipleship. How do we specify behavior? How do we warrant our behavior? How do we witness to, how do we use the witness of the past and in Scripture to our practices today? What is the witness of both Scripture and tradition to how we should live today? We've talked about this as well in this opening lecture in terms of the use of Scripture. And then another interpretation task is interpreting the text with respect to the context, the co-text, and then to add to two things we've talked about before, to say also in terms of communication and the construction of meaning. Yes, we've talked about the construction of meaning, but thinking about different ways of communicating. And so here we might talk about the historical cultural context and language in the text and the author's speech acts that we've talked about. And then as we move to the synthetic task, we could talk about the canonical context, a synchronic study of biblical language and imagery, and a synthesizing of the communication of authors, canonical texts, and readers. All of that should sound familiar to you, but now broken up in terms of different tasks of theology. And so then, continuing with the convictional task, we might look at the context and co-text and communication and construction of meaning in terms of church history. How has the church done this through the ages? In terms of tradition and community, and in terms of the communication and construction of theology and ethics by readers, by communities. And the pragmatic task then could look at these issues of interpretation in terms of the community's context, the contemporary context, the local community, with respect to using the traditions theology that we get, and with respect to how it's communicated and how communities construct certain practices within their contexts. And then the last row on this slide has to do with determining the meaning of the biblical text in terms of types of meaning. So we've talked about this in terms of 4 different types of meaning. Here I try to put an emphasis with respect to the 4 tasks of interpretation. So on the descriptive task, the primary focus that we have is, what does the author mean? Then we move to the synthetic task, where we're looking at theological implications of texts within the canon. And then the convictional task puts an emphasis on the significance of the text for the Christian and the Christian community in developing their convictions. The reader's tradition and context, the biblical text is authoritative within the believing community at this level for many Christian churches. And then the pragmatic task tends to put an emphasis on the applications of the text in our day and the context in which we dwell for those applications. Or we might say simply that we're asking the question, how do we live the text in our context? Now here I want to point out a problem with the use of the word application. If we understand the convictional task to be getting a pristine theology that's a collection of ideas that can be presented in a system of thought that has nothing to do with context, then we're going to understand the pragmatic task in terms of, and how do we apply that system of theology to different contexts. Now that is often an approach taken, and so the convictional task becomes the systematic theological task for some people. And really then what happens in systematic theology is the goal is to get away from the context in which Scripture is written to a theology that is contextless, that is a system of ideas. And then the pragmatic task is to recontextualize the theology, to apply that contextless theology in our day, in our community, to the issues that we're facing. Now, I would suggest that that's a bad understanding of theology, and that the convictional task should not be understood in terms of contextless ideas. So then the pragmatic task, the alternative understanding of the pragmatic task would be having studied what the text says in its context, and having studied how the church has, through the ages, applied the text in its contexts, still context focused, then the question becomes pragmatic task, and how do we do this in our context today? So the theological tasks on this understanding are always contextual. And therefore, the primary approach to reasoning is going to be analogical. Having seen how it's done before, how it's done in the authoritative text of Scripture, how it's been done through the ages in the church, now how do we analogously live out the meaning of the text in our day? This slide is an attempt to put some of what we've said earlier into a chart form regarding communication and meaning. And so we have verbal communication that takes place in terms of what some scholars have called lang versus parole. Lang has to do with the system of signs, the denotation or morphology or lexicography. In other words, language understood in terms of the lexicon and the grammar. And then parole is how it's actually used. Parole is spoken communication, how different groups might use the language. Parole is a series of speech acts. It focuses on connotation and syntax, how words have meaning because of how they're used in a sentence, not because of how they're stated within a lexicon or dictionary. And then also other levels of verbal communication, that we've talked about have to do with genre, but then also dialogue. And I haven't talked too much about dialogue in the lecture so far, but then how does this play out further? So let's go back up to Lang in this chart. We can then talk about how communication takes place through actions, and this then would be a way of distinguishing communication through movement and actions, through acting, the actual process. So how do you distinguish between actions and acting? Well, you might say, we do this, we practice baptism, but then how do we actually practice baptism when we do it? That's putting more of an emphasis on the dynamics of the acting rather than just the action, we baptize. And then we could talk about performance, the communication through actions in terms of performance. It's one thing to talk about a Shakespeare play. It's another thing to talk about how different theaters put on that particular play. And so there can be a great variety of performance. We can talk about how we practice baptism, but then we can say, but we perform this differently. Some perform it through infant baptism, some perform it through adult baptism, some with this kind of water, that kind of water, with this kind of ceremony or that kind of ceremony. The performance can be quite different. And then in terms of practices themselves, baptism being the practice in this case, the Lord's Supper, all kinds of different practices. Some Christian communities with very few clearly defined practices, others with lots of ceremony, but not just in terms of worship and liturgy, but also in terms of ethics and mission. Will give us some specific practices. Then we could talk about author's intentions. And here we've already talked about speech-act theory in terms of locution, illocution, and perlocution. The last category with dialogue then would introduce the idea of interlocution. How do we go about our dialogue? And then another way of talking about communication and meaning is in terms of the text's linguistic conventions. So we could talk about conventional rules of vocabulary, grammar, and syntax, but then the actual performance of speech level, we would talk about rhetoric, discourse, and our analysis of how discourse takes place. And then in terms of the literature, as opposed to speech, we could talk about cotext. How is this particular writing written? The literary context. Then we could move on to the third category of genre and talk about the text linguistic conventions in terms of the actual genre, the rhetorical species. What kind of speech is it? Is it a judicial speech? In the law court, is it a deliberative speech, say in Parliament or Congress? Is it an epideictic speech? That's an occasional speech like a wedding or a speech delivered at a funeral or a birthday party. What kind of rhetoric is this? And then we could talk about the openness and closedness of texts. And then at the dialogue level, we could talk about intertextuality. There's a dialogue sometimes set up between a New Testament author and an Old Testament text. How is Paul reading Isaiah or Deuteronomy or both together? And then there's also the narrative substructure. So Paul is writing this letter to this church, but underlying what he's saying theologically is a certain narrative of how God is relating to his people as understood through the Old Testament. So dialogue then takes place with a certain understood, accepted, common narrative substructure to the dialogue. And the final category here is the reader's communicative context, where we have the historical, cultural, and social dimensions to the reader's communicative context. So they might hear or read something written. They might also be involved in recognizing, perceiving, and appreciating what is being stated in the actual performance of speech, or the receiving of a letter in context. There's also the importance of understanding that the readers need to appreciate. Their role is not simply to use words however they want to, but to understand what has been communicated. And so therefore, at the dialogue level, we need to talk about interaction in dialogue and responding appropriately to the communication between an author and text and its readers. And so then we could also draw out from this chart on communication and meaning are different words for types of meaning. Meaning is the author intended, the implications of what the author has stated that are based in the author's intention, but perhaps even go beyond what the author saw, the significance for different groups, and then the In this introduction to the course, Interpreting the New Testament, we've covered 4 topics. First of all, we looked at exegesis. Exegesis has to do with leading the meaning out of the text, as opposed to leading your own meaning into the text, which is eisegesis. To do exegesis, we have to pay attention to the original context. Context is the key. Secondly, we looked at rival versions of inquiry. There's the modernist approach. In the modernist approach, scientifically established facts form an objective foundation for beliefs. In a postmodernist approach to inquiry, there is no objective truth, but only socially formed convictions that are either useful or harmful. And then there's the traditional approach to inquiry. In the traditional approach to inquiry, faith is accepted as the starting point. And so the approach to inquiry is faith-seeking understanding. Thirdly, we looked at meaning. There are 4 types of meaning. We might use the word meaning for a specific purpose to get at the author's intention. But then we sometimes really mean by meaning the word implications of the text. In this case, we're saying what are the implications of what the author's intention was. And then there's also another word we could use for meaning, that is significance. The significance to the original participants or audience of the author's intention. And the original participants and audience can ask questions about what the implications are of what the author is writing or saying. And then we could use another word, the word application, to get at meaning. And we could use that for the subsequent application made by readers at a later time. And finally, we looked at the tasks of interpretation, the descriptive, synthetic, convictional, and pragmatic tasks. And we recognize that these tasks cannot always easily be separated. But in a course in interpreting the New Testament, our primary focus is on the descriptive task, which is the exegetical task. And so with this introduction then, we move on to a course focused primarily on methodologies of exegesis.